The rain tapped softly against the diner windows, mixing with the low hum of a classic rock song playing over the speakers. Lila wiped her hands on her apron and glanced at the clock above the counter. It was almost closing time, but one customer still sat in the far corner booth sipping his coffee slowly like he had nowhere else to be. She had served him earlier, a tall man in a dark suit that looked expensive, even when wrinkled from a long day. He hadn't said much, just nodded politely and thanked her after each refill. She walked past his table again, collecting empty plates and used napkins. As she leaned down to pick up his cup, something caught her eye. His wallet was open on the table beside his untouched toast, and sticking out slightly was a small photo. She paused for just a second too long, staring at the faded image of a young woman with big brown eyes and soft curls pulled back into a loose ponytail. The face was unmistakable. It was her mother, only younger, maybe early 20s. Her heart pounded suddenly, confusion flooding her mind. What was her mother's picture doing in this stranger's wallet? She straightened up slowly, trying to keep her voice calm. "Sir," she said, looking at him now, "can I ask you something?" He lifted his gaze from the window where he had been watching the rain fall in steady sheets. His eyes were tired but kind, the kind of eyes that had seen a lot and carried stories behind them. "Of course," he replied, setting his cup down carefully. Lila pointed at the wallet. "Why is my mother's picture in your wallet?" For a moment he didn't react. Then slowly, his expression changed. Surprise gave way to shock, then something deeper. Pain, maybe even guilt. He stared at the photo, then at her face, as if trying to match pieces of a puzzle he thought was lost forever. What did you say?" he asked quietly, voice barely above a whisper. "I said, why is my mother's picture in your wallet?" Lila repeated, firmer this time. She wasn't sure why she felt so bold, but something inside her told her this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't some random photo. This was important. He looked away for a moment, swallowing hard, then reached for the wallet. He pulled out the photo gently, holding it between two fingers like it was something sacred. "This woman," he began, voice shaky. "Her name was Clara." Lila froze. That was her mother's name. "How do you know my mother?" she demanded, crossing her arms. He looked up at her now, really looked at her, studying every feature of her face. His lips parted slightly as if he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Finally, he cleared his throat. I think we need to talk." He gestured toward the empty seat across from him, and reluctantly, Lila sat down. The other customers had left, and the cook had gone home. It was just the two of them now, surrounded by the quiet buzz of the diner lights and the sound of the rain outside. "My name is Richard Hayes," he said finally. "And Clara, she was someone very important to me, a long time ago." Lila's stomach twisted. "How long ago?" Richard looked down at the photo again, his thumb brushing the edge lightly. "More than 25 years. We met when I was just starting out, before any of this." He motioned vaguely to his suit to himself. "I was working 2 jobs, trying to finish school, and she walked into my life like a storm. Beautiful, wild, full of dreams. We fell in love fast, harder than I ever thought possible." Lila listened, stunned. Her mother had never talked about anyone like this. All she knew was that her father had died before she was born, killed in a car crash. But here was a man sitting in front of her, speaking about Clara like they had built something real together. "What happened?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Richard's jaw tightened. "We were going to get married. She was pregnant," he said, voice cracking slightly. "But before I could propose, she disappeared. One day she was just gone. No note, no goodbye. I looked for her everywhere, hired people, called every number I had. Nothing. I thought I'd imagined her sometimes, like she was just a dream I made up to survive those hard years." Lila felt tears prick her eyes. "That baby, that was me," she said, her voice shaking. Richard's breath caught. You're her daughter? She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Yes, my name's Lila. Clara was my mom. She passed away 2 years ago. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Richard looked like he might cry or collapse or both. He closed his eyes briefly, pressing his fingers to his temples as if trying to process everything. She never told me, he whispered. She never told me I had a daughter. Lila swallowed hard. She said my dad died in a car accident, that's all she ever told me. Richard shook his head. No, that's not true. There was no accident. She left. Why would she leave without telling me? Why wouldn't she tell you who I was? Lila didn't have an answer. Her whole life she had believed the story her mother told. Now everything was unraveling like a thread pulled too tight. They sat there for a long time, neither of them speaking, just absorbing the weight of the truth. Outside, the rain slowed, the sky clearing slightly. Inside the diner, though, the storm had just begun. Finally, Richard opened his eyes again, determination replacing the shock. I need to know what happened, he said. I need to understand why she left. And I want to know everything about you, Lila. If you'll let me. Lila hesitated. She had spent her entire life believing one story, and now another was unfolding before her. She didn't know if she was ready to trust this man, but something deep inside told her she couldn't turn away either. I don't know, she admitted, but I guess I want to know too. Outside, the first rays of morning light broke through the clouds, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange. Somewhere beyond the diner, the world kept turning, unaware of the lives that had just changed forever. The morning after their shocking conversation, Lila sat on the edge of her small apartment bed, staring at the cracked wall in front of her. The rain had stopped, but the sky still looked gray, just like her mood. She couldn't stop thinking about Richard's words, about the photo in his wallet, and most of all, about her mother. All her life she had believed Clara was a widow, raising her alone after losing the love of her life in a tragic accident. But now that story felt like a lie, or at least a half-truth. She reached for her phone and scrolled through old photos stored in a dusty folder labeled Mom. There were pictures of Clara laughing with friends, holding Lila as a baby, sitting on the porch with a cup of tea. Not one of them showed a man who could be Richard. Her heart twisted every time she looked at those eyes, so much like her own. She had always thought she got her looks from her mother. Now she wondered how much came from the man she had only just met. Across town, Richard sat in his office high above the city skyline, staring out the window at the sleeping buildings below. His mind was miles away, stuck in the past. He had built an empire from nothing, rising from late-night shifts at a gas station to owning companies that stretched across continents. But none of it filled the hole left behind when Clara disappeared. And now, knowing she had been alive all these years, knowing they had a daughter together made him feel like he was drowning in memories. He picked up his phone and dialed his assistant. I need someone good, he said without greeting. Someone who can dig into the past. Old records, missing persons, anything related to Clara Bennett. Yes, sir, came the reply. That same day, Lila got a call from a number she didn't recognize. When she answered, a calm voice introduced itself as a private investigator hired by Richard Hayes. He explained that he needed to speak with her about her mother, about what she remembered, about any letters, documents, or people who might have known Clara back then. I don't know if I can do this, Lila said, gripping the phone tightly. Miss Lila, the man said gently, this is about your history. If you want answers, we have to start somewhere. So she agreed to meet him at a small cafe 2 blocks from the diner. She brought a box of old things her mother had kept, birthday cards, hospital bracelets, even a faded ultrasound picture from when she was born. As the investigator flipped through the items, he paused at a letter tucked inside a worn envelope. This? Handwriting, he murmured. Does it look familiar? Lila leaned over. No, why? It matches some notes we found in Richard's old storage unit. Your mother must have written to him once. They both stared at the letter, untouched. For years, It wasn't opened, which meant Richard had never read it. Lila's hands trembled as she reached for it. "Can I keep this?" she asked. The investigator nodded. "It belongs to you now." That night, Lila sat alone in her kitchen, the letter resting on the table like a ticking bomb. She turned it over again and again, afraid of what it might say. Finally, she took a deep breath and carefully tore it open. Inside, the paper smelled faintly of lavender, just like her mother's perfume. The writing was neat but hurried, like it had been written in a rush. "Dear Richard, I hope this letter finds you. I tried calling, but your number doesn't work anymore. Please don't think I left you on purpose. Something happened, something I couldn't control. My parents found out about the baby, and they threatened to take everything away. They said they'd make sure you never found us if I stayed. I had no choice. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you myself. I wanted to more than anything. But I had to protect our child. Please believe me, I never stopped loving you. I never will. Clara." Tears blurred the ink as Lila read the words, again and again. Her mother hadn't lied, not exactly. She had protected her, yes, but she had also kept her from knowing the truth. A truth that had shaped her entire life without her ever realizing it. The next morning, Lila called Richard. When he answered, she didn't waste time. "We need to talk again. I found something." Within the hour, they were sitting across from each other in the same booth at the diner where it all began. Lila slid the letter across the table. Richard's hands shook as he unfolded it. His eyes scanned the lines quickly, then slowly, then again. By the end, tears streamed down his face. "She wrote this," he whispered. "She tried to reach me." "She did," Lila said softly. "But it never got to you." Richard wiped his face and looked at her, really looked at her. "She gave you to me in her own way," he said, "even if it took 25 years. Lila didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure how to feel, angry, sad, relieved, maybe all of it at once. "What happens now?" she asked finally. Richard placed the letter back in the envelope and held it like it was gold. "Now," he said, "we find out the rest of the story." Over the next few weeks, pieces of the past began to surface. The investigator tracked down old neighbors, distant relatives, even a former co-worker of Clara's who remembered her talking about a man named Richard before she suddenly moved away. Every clue painted a clearer picture of a young woman caught between love and family pressure, forced to choose between keeping her child safe and protecting the man she loved. One evening, Lila visited Richard at his home for the first time. It was a modest place compared to what she expected. Not a mansion, just a quiet house with books stacked on every shelf and photos of places he had traveled. On the fireplace mantel was another framed copy of the same photo from his wallet. He noticed her looking at it. "She was my beginning," he said simply. "And now you're my second chance." Lila didn't know how to respond. She had spent her whole life feeling like something was missing, like a part of her was hidden just out of reach. Now that it was within her grasp, she didn't know whether to run toward it or turn away. As the days passed, they talked more, about Clara, about Lila's childhood, about the dreams Richard had once had before money changed everything. Slowly, awkwardness turned into understanding. Strangers became something closer to family. Then one afternoon, Richard handed Lila a small envelope. Inside was a check, enough to cover rent for months, maybe even years. "I want to help you," he said. "You shouldn't have to struggle like this." Lila stared at the check, then back at him. "I appreciate it," she said carefully, "but I don't want your money. Not yet. I need to figure out who I am, outside of all this. Just give me time." Richard smiled slightly, nodding. "Okay, take all the time you need." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds again, casting golden light over the city. Somewhere beyond the noise and chaos, a new chapter was beginning. Not just for Lila and Richard, but for the memory of Clara, the woman who had quietly shaped both their lives without ever telling them. Lila couldn't sleep. The check Richard had given her sat on the kitchen counter like a ghost, reminding her of everything she wasn't ready for. She turned in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Clara. Her mother's soft voice, the way she used to hum old songs while cooking, how she never talked about the past unless it was about Lila's first steps or her first day of school. Never once had she mentioned Richard. Never once had she said his name. The next morning, Lila went to work as usual, slipping into her stained apron and tying her hair back. The diner was busy, filled with the usual rush of tired workers and early risers. She moved through the tables like a shadow, taking orders, refilling coffee, smiling when needed. But inside, she felt different, like something had shifted. Beneath her skin, something she couldn't explain. As she wiped down the counter, a familiar figure walked in. Richard. He looked tired but determined, dressed in a simple jacket instead of his usual suit. He nodded at her and took a seat in the same booth as before, waiting quietly. Lila finished pouring another customer's drink before walking over. "You're up early," she said, trying to sound normal. Richard smiled slightly. "Couldn't sleep." "Me neither." He studied her face for a moment. "You didn't cash the check." Lila hesitated. "No, I told you I'm not ready for that yet." "I understand," he said. "But I want to help. I just don't know how." She sighed, leaning against the table slightly. "Maybe start by helping me understand why my mom kept this from me." Richard nodded. "Okay, let's do that." Later that evening, after her shift ended, they met again, this time at a small library across town. The investigator had left behind a folder of documents, things he had collected over the past few weeks. Birth records, old phone numbers, even a copy of Clara's last known address before she disappeared. They sat at a quiet table near the back, flipping through the pages together. Most of it was dry information, dates and names that meant little without context. But then Lila found something, a letter addressed to Clara from a lawyer. It was dated a few months after she left Richard. "What is this?" she asked, handing it to him. Richard read it carefully, his expression darkening. "This is from her parents," he said. "They threatened legal action if she didn't give up the baby." Lila swallowed hard. "So they tried to take me away?" Richard looked at her, eyes full of pain. "Yes, and your mother refused." That night, Lila couldn't stop thinking about it. Her whole life she had believed her father was dead. Now she knew the truth, that he had been alive all along, searching for someone who had been taken from him. And her grandparents, the only ones she had ever known, had played a role in tearing their family apart. The next day, she called Richard again. "I want to meet them." He hesitated. "Are you sure?" "No," she admitted, "but I need to." Meeting Clara's parents was harder than she expected. They lived in a quiet neighborhood far from the city, in a house that smelled like old books and lavender soap. When they opened the door and saw Lila, their faces changed, not with surprise, but with guilt. "I knew this day would come," her grandmother whispered, stepping aside to let her in. Lila sat across from them, in their living room, hands folded tightly in her lap. Richard stood nearby, silent but present. For a long time, no one spoke. Finally, Lila looked at them and said, "Why did you make her leave him?" Her grandfather cleared his throat. "We thought we were protecting her." "From what?" she demanded. "From love? From the truth?" Her grandmother reached for her hand, but Lila pulled away. "Back then, Richard had nothing. No money, no future. We wanted better for Clara. We thought if she stayed, she'd end up poor and alone." "She was alone," Lila shot back. "And so was I." Richard finally spoke. "Did you know she was pregnant?" They both looked down. "Yes," her grandfather admitted. "We gave her an ultimatum. Leave you alone or lose everything. And she chose me," Lila said softly. "She did." Her grandmother agreed. "But we made her promise never to tell you the truth." Lila shook her head. "You had no right. We know." her grandfather said, and we've regretted it every day. After that, the conversation became quieter. There were no apologies loud enough to erase the years lost, no words that could fix what had already happened. But for the first time, Lila understood. Her grandparents hadn't acted out of hate, just fear. Fear of failure, of poverty, of losing control. And in the process, they had cost her the chance to know her father. Leaving their house, Lila felt empty. Richard drove her back in silence, letting her think. As they pulled up to her apartment, she finally spoke. "I'm angry," she said. "But I don't know who I'm angry at." Richard looked at her gently. "It's okay to feel that way. You've been carrying someone else's secret your whole life." She nodded slowly. "I just wish Mom had told me." "So do I," said. Days passed, then weeks. Slowly, Lila began to adjust. She still worked at the diner, still served food, still dealt with rude customers and long shifts. But now she carried something different inside her, a sense of belonging even if it was new and fragile. One afternoon, Richard showed up with 2 tickets in his hand. "Come with me," he said. "Where are we going?" she asked. "To see where it all started." They flew to a small town hours away where Richard had grown up. He took her to the old gas station where he used to work nights, the tiny apartment where he barely slept, the park bench where he and Clara used to sit under the stars. "This is where I proposed," he said quietly, pulling a small box from his pocket. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, covered in dust from years of being hidden away. "I never got to give it to her," he said. "Now I guess I can remember her with you." Lila looked at the ring, then at him. "Thank you," she whispered. Standing there, surrounded by the echoes of the past, she realized something important. This wasn't just about finding her father. It was about healing. About putting pieces of a broken story back together, one page at a time. And as the sun set over the town that had shaped both their lives, Lila felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Lila stood at the edge of the small town park, watching the wind rustle through the trees. It was the same park where Richard had once sat with Clara, where they had whispered dreams under the stars and held hands like nothing could ever pull them apart. Now, decades later, their daughter walked the same path, trying to understand a story that had never been told. Richard watched her from a distance, giving her space, but staying close enough to offer comfort if she needed it. He had changed since their first meeting in the diner. The cold, composed billionaire had softened, revealing layers he had buried beneath years of success and silence. Lila saw it now. Not just the man who built an empire, but the one who had lost everything before he even knew what he had. That night they stayed in a small hotel near the old gas station where Richard used to work. The room smelled faintly of dust and lavender soap, much like Clara's house used to. Lila lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every word she had learned so far. Her mother had loved this man. She had carried his child in secret, fought for her right to raise her alone, and still kept the truth hidden until the end. Why? She turned to Richard, who sat by the window, looking out at the dark street below. "Did you ever think about having kids after Mom left?" Richard didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "Every day," he admitted. "I thought about what our life would have been like. I imagined birthdays, school plays, holidays, but I always believed I'd lost all of that forever." Lila swallowed hard. "You missed everything." He nodded slowly. "And I don't know how to make that up." She looked at him then, really looked. Not as the powerful businessman who could buy anything he wanted, but as a man who had spent 25 years mourning a love he never got to say goodbye to. And now standing beside her, he wasn't just her father. He was someone who had lived half a life waiting for answers he never thought he'd get. The next morning, they visited the town cemetery. It wasn't something either of them had planned, but somehow they both knew it was time. The grave was simple, surrounded by wildflowers and untouched by time. Lila traced her fingers over the stone, reading the name carved into it. Clara Bennett, beloved mother, devoted friend. She never talked about you, Lila said softly. But I think she carried you with her every day. Richard placed a hand on the stone, closing his eyes. I hope she knew I never stopped loving her. They stayed there for a long time, neither of them speaking, just remembering. Then Lila reached into her bag and pulled out the letter she had found weeks ago, the one Clara had written but never sent. Without hesitation, she placed it beside the flowers on the grave. This is yours, she whispered, even if he never got to read it. Richard looked at her, surprised. You're leaving it here? She nodded. It belongs with her now. As they walked away, something shifted between them. A wall that had been built from years of pain and silence cracked open, letting in light they hadn't realized they needed. Back in the city, life continued. Lila returned to the diner, slipping back into her routine like an old pair of shoes. But now, when customers complained or the hours stretched too long, she didn't feel quite as trapped. There was something bigger beyond these walls. A future she hadn't seen before. One afternoon, while wiping down tables, she noticed Richard sitting in his usual booth, watching her with quiet pride. She walked over with a fresh pot of coffee. You keep showing up, she teased. People are going to think you own this place. He smiled. Maybe I should. She raised an eyebrow. Are you saying you want to invest in a struggling diner? I'm saying, he corrected, that I want to help you build something better. She poured his coffee without answering. I'm not ready for that yet. I know, he said simply. But when you are, I'll be here. Over the following weeks, they began spending more time together. Sometimes they went to dinner, sometimes they just talked in the diner long after closing. They shared stories. Lila told him about her first day of school, the time she broke, her arm falling off a swing, the way Clara used to sing lullabies when she couldn't sleep. Richard told her about his childhood, the nights he worked double shifts just to afford books, the moment he realized he had made it. One evening, Lila asked the question she had been avoiding. Do you blame my grandparents? Richard was quiet for a long time. Yes, he admitted. But I also understand why they did what they did. Fear does strange things to people. They took everything from us, she said. They tried to, he agreed. But we found each other anyway. A few days later, Lila received a package in the mail. Inside was a framed photo. Richard and Clara, young and smiling, arms wrapped around each other like they were the only two people in the world. On the back, a note was written in Richard's neat handwriting. I thought you might want to see her happy. She stared at the photo for a long time, tracing the edges with her fingertips. This was the mother she had never known, the woman who had danced under stars, who had fallen in love with a man who would become a stranger to her daughter, and now, thanks to fate and a rainy Thursday night in a nearly empty diner, Lila had a piece of that life back. She placed the photo on her nightstand, next to a smaller picture of herself and Clara taken years ago. 2 generations, separated by secrets, now connected by truth. Later that week, she met Richard at the park again. This time the sky was clear and the air smelled like spring. They sat on a bench, watching children run past them, chasing each other with laughter. I've been thinking, Lila said, about what happens next. Richard turned to her. What do you mean? She hesitated, then smiled slightly. I don't know exactly, but I think maybe we can figure it out together. He looked at her, eyes filled with something she hadn't seen before, hope. Yeah, he said softly. I think we can. And as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting golden light across the park, they sat side by side, not as strangers anymore, but as family. The days that followed felt different for Lila. It was hard to explain, but something inside her had shifted. She still woke up early, still put on the same uniform, still walked into the diner with tired feet and aching muscles. But now, when she looked at the world around her, it didn't feel quite as heavy. The weight of not knowing who she was, of feeling like something was always missing, that weight had started to lift. She found herself smiling more, even during the busiest shifts. Customers noticed. Her coworkers asked if she had gotten a raise or fallen in love. She just laughed and said, something like that. Richard began visiting more often, sometimes sitting in the diner for hours without saying much, just watching life pass by. He never acted like he owned half the city. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did talk, his words carried meaning. People respected him, not because of his money, but because of the way he treated others. One evening after closing, Lila joined him in his car, unsure where they were going. He drove in silence for a while, then pulled into a quiet parking lot, overlooking the city lights. "I've been thinking," he said, turning to her. "You deserve more than this life." Lila frowned slightly. "This life isn't so bad." He shook his head. "I'm not saying it is. I'm saying you have options now. You don't have to stay stuck in the same place forever." She looked out at the skyline, watching the lights flicker like stars on the ground. "I know," she said softly, "but I'm not ready to leave yet." Richard nodded. "That's okay. Just promise me you won't forget that you're capable of anything." She turned to him, surprised by the emotion in his voice. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked. "You didn't have to come looking for me. You could have kept living your life like nothing ever happened." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Because you're my daughter. And I missed 25 years of your life. I can't get those back, but I can make sure the next 25 count." Lila didn't say anything for a long time. She just sat there, letting his words settle into her bones. She had spent so many years believing she was alone in the world, that her mother had given her everything she had. And she had. But now she realized she had inherited something else too. A father who loved her from a distance before he even knew her name. A few weeks later, Richard invited her to one of his company events. It was a charity gala, full of people in suits and dresses, sipping wine and pretending they cared about the cause. Lila felt completely out of place in her borrowed dress, surrounded by strangers who talked about things she barely understood. But Richard stayed close, introducing her to people, with pride in his voice. "This is Lila," he would say, "my daughter." Some people reacted with surprise, others with curiosity. A few older guests recognized her last name and whispered among themselves. Lila ignored them, focusing instead on how Richard's posture changed whenever he said those words. "My daughter." It was like he had been waiting his whole life to say them. Later that night, as they stood outside watching the city glow, Lila finally asked what had been on her mind all evening. "Do you ever think about what our lives would have been like if Mom hadn't left?" Richard sighed, staring at the sky. "Every day," he admitted. "I imagine us raising you together, taking you to school, helping with homework, teaching you how to ride a bike. All the little moments most parents take for granted." Lila swallowed hard. "I wish I could give those to you." "You already have," he said gently, "just by being here." They stayed outside for a while longer, neither of them speaking, just breathing in the cool night air. Then Richard reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "This came today," he said, handing it to her. Lila opened it carefully. Inside was another letter, this one written in Clara's handwriting. The words were short, but powerful. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I hope you found each other. I hope you forgave me. Most of all, I hope you know how much I loved you both." Tears filled Lila's eyes as she read it again and again. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. It was a final message. A piece of her mother she had never known existed. "She wanted us to find each other," Lila whispered. Richard nodded. "And we did." Back at the apartment, Lila placed the letter beside the photo of Clara and Richard. She traced her fingers over the frame, whispering, "Thank you, Mom." Life continued, slowly but surely. Lila still worked at the diner, still served coffee and pancakes to tired workers and hungry tourists. But now she saw it differently. This wasn't just a job anymore, it was part of her story, part of who she was. And when Richard showed up every few days, always with a new question or a memory to share, she no longer felt like a stranger meeting someone important. She felt like family. One afternoon, he handed her a book. "Read this," he said. "It might help you decide what comes next." She flipped through the pages, realizing it was about business management, financial planning, and entrepreneurship. "You think I should start my own business?" she asked. "I think," he said with a smile, "you should do whatever makes you happy." Lila stared at the book for a long time. She didn't know if she was ready to run a business, but she did know she wanted more. Not because Richard expected it, but because she deserved it. As the seasons changed and the city moved forward, so did they. Slowly, step by step, they built something real. Not just a relationship between father and daughter, but a future they could both believe in. And somewhere, high above the streets, Clara watched over them, knowing that in the end, love had found its way back. Lila stood at the front of the small, newly painted cafe, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the sign above the door. The words read, "Clara's Place." It wasn't just a name. It was a promise. A tribute. A beginning. Behind her, Richard watched with quiet pride. He had offered to fund everything, but Lila had insisted on doing most of it herself. She wanted this to be hers, even if he had quietly helped when things got tough. Now, after months of planning, saving, and working late nights, the dream she hadn't known she had was finally real. The doors opened for the first time that morning, and a soft breeze carried the scent of fresh coffee and baked bread into the street. A few curious locals wandered in, looking around with smiles. Some recognized Richard from the news. Others didn't care who he was. They were there for the warmth, the atmosphere, the feeling that this place belonged to everyone. Lila moved behind the counter, pouring the first cup of coffee of the day. Her apron was clean, her hair tied back, and for once she wasn't thinking about how tired she was or how hard the past year had been. She was thinking about how far she had come. Richard sat at one of the corner tables, watching her like a proud father. He had changed since they first met in the diner, not in looks but in spirit. There was a lightness to him now, something that hadn't been there before. He still ran his companies, still traveled when needed. But now he made time for the little things, for birthdays, for quiet conversations over coffee, for sitting in silence while Lila figured out who she was becoming. As the day went on, more people arrived. Friends from the old diner, neighbors from the area, even a few strangers, drawn in by the smell of cinnamon rolls and freshly brewed espresso. By lunchtime, every table was full and laughter filled the space like music. Lila worked tirelessly, serving plates, refilling cups, smiling until her cheeks hurt. She didn't mind. This was what she had dreamed of. Not wealth or fame, but a place where people could feel at home. A place that honored the woman who had given her everything without ever telling her the truth. Later that evening, after closing up, she joined Richard outside under the string lights that lined the patio. The city hummed around them, but here, in this moment, everything felt still. "It happened," she said softly. He smiled. "What did?" "Our beginning." Richard looked at her, eyes warm. "You built this." "I did," she agreed. "And I couldn't have done it without you." He shook his head. "You would have found your way either way. I just got lucky. Enough to walk beside you." They sat there for a while talking about everything and nothing. About Clara, about the future, about the strange and beautiful way life had brought them together. Lila no longer felt lost. She knew who she was, not just Richard's daughter, not just Clara's child, but someone who had fought for her own story and written her own path. Weeks turned into months, and Clara's Place became more than just a cafe. It became a neighborhood favorite. People came for the food, stayed for the kindness, and returned for the sense of belonging. Lila hired staff, trained new baristas, and even started hosting open mic nights where local musicians played and poets shared their words. One night, during a poetry reading, a woman stepped onto the small stage and began to speak. Her voice was soft but strong, and as she read, Lila felt tears prick her eyes. "The past is never truly gone," the poet said. "It lives in our choices, in our love, in the way we rebuild what was broken. And sometimes it finds us again, not as it was, but as something better." Lila looked across the room at Richard, who was listening intently, a small smile on his face. In that moment, she understood. Their story had been broken once, torn apart by fear and silence. But now it was being rewritten, not with bitterness, but with understanding. Not with regret, but with gratitude. Later that night, after the last customer left and the lights were dimmed, Lila walked outside and looked up at the sky. The stars were bright, scattered like memories across the dark canvas above. She thought of Clara, of her laugh, her strength, the sacrifices she had made. She thought of Richard, of his patience, his love, the way he had waited 25 years for a daughter he never knew existed, and she thought of herself, not as someone defined by the past, but as someone building her own future. The next morning, Lila woke up early, just like always. She put on her apron, tied her hair back, and stepped into the cafe that bore her mother's name. The smell of coffee filled the air, and the city outside was waking up. She walked behind the counter, ready to start another day. Ready to keep going, because now she knew who she was and she knew where she was going.